or the more they vibrate, the higher the frequency of the sound produced. You know, I often say this to these kids at the prison. They say, you know, they breathe in helium. They say, oh yeah, I got high as helium's inert. You don't get high off of helium. The reason that it causes a higher frequency vibration in your vocal cords is because it's much lighter than air and it travels much faster. So it passes the vocal cords and they vibrate at a higher frequency. Okay, just a little bit of useless information in case anybody says they're getting high.
Not on the test, eh?
Not on the test. Okay, now we're going to look at the bronchial tree. If you look on the next page, you see that diagram, and this is figure 16.6.
16.6.
Yeah. The trachea conducts air between the larynx and the bronchi. All right, and again, if you look down below the cricoid cartilage, you see this series of these cartilaginous rings that comprise most of the trachea. Okay? All right. Now that trachea comes down, and again is protected by these cartilaginous rings. I guess I shouldn't show it, but, and then it bifurcates, it splits. Actually, I should probably do that down like that. And then this one, not quite so acute an angle, because then it splits into the, well, since we're looking that way, I'll do it like this. The right main stem bronchus is straighter and shorter than the left main stem bronchus, okay? And then this area here where it sort of ends is called the carina. And I bring that up because if you're putting a tube into somebody's trachea and you hit that carina, you're going to know it, because that person is going to spasm and sputter and spit, and you're going to have a whale of a time. All right, so the right main stem bronchus is a little bit less acute of an angle than the left main stem bronchus. And then these bronchi, these main stem bronchi, you know, they will further subdivide into smaller and smaller and smaller branches. Okay, you'll see you have the main stem bronchus, and then you have these things called, well, you have the main right and left bronchus, main stem bronchus. And then you have bronchi, H-A-I, and then you have these bronchioles. And again, I don't know if you remember when we were talking about blood vessels, but that suffix IOLES means just smaller versions of the structure that came before it. Okay? Now, and these all branch out and they comprise your lung tissue. Okay, now the important part about this is when we get down to the bronchioles, you'll have a terminal bronchiole, IOLE, which we'll call this one, and then you'll have your respiratory bronchioles, and then they will terminate into these sac-like clusters. And I'm not going to get too weird that we know, you know, all the way down there. But what's important is we have these sac-like clusters, and these are referred to as alveoli. All right, now, two important points I want to make about this. These alveoli are where gas exchange takes place. Now, so if you were to, sort of think about that a little bit deeper and refer back to a few other chapters, the types of cells that make up these alveoli to be adapted for, are especially adapted for diffusion, i.e. the diffusion of oxygen coming from the incoming air, and then surrounding these alveoli are these blood vessels, and I'll make them a little bit larger than they normally are, that are called pulmonary capillaries. And I believe there's a diagram that in your book, and I'll take a look at that yes, and if you look on page 505, figures 16.8 and 16.9, you'll see these alveoli, alveolus for singular, and surrounding those alveoli are capillaries. You see, this is a venous end of the capillary, and that's the arterial end. Simple squamous epithelium. And if you remember from our discussion in tissues, simple squamous epithelium. Simple means one layer. Squamous means flat. Okay, so one layer of these flat cells.
Those are all on the first test. Do you think we'll see them again?
Yes. Okay, so make a note. And it's important because, and if you think about it intuitively, it's like you don't want multiple layers of cells in these structures because oxygen has to move into the blood, into these capillaries by simple diffusion, just driven by a concentration gradient. And carbon dioxide from the blood has to diffuse, from the blood. The CO2 has to go from the blood into the alveoli so we can breathe it out, and O2, oxygen, has to diffuse from these alveolar sacs into the blood. So you don't want multiple layers of cells, because if you increase the distance that diffusion has to take place, problems arise, okay? And I'll mention that in a second. So we have these simple squamous epithelium surrounded by, and all of these air sacs are surrounded by capillaries, which are exchange vessels. Okay, they're one cell thick, simple squamous epithelium, highly adapted for diffusion. CO2 can diffuse out of the blood into the capillaries and then move out of the respiratory tract. And then oxygen can diffuse from the alveoli into the blood and make its way around the rest of the body. All right? Now, a couple of important things about these alveoli. Oh, before I do that. Now, all the area from here, from your mouth and your nose, all the way down to here is what we call anatomical dead space. And why do they call it that? Well, they call it that because no gas exchange takes place. The only place in our respiratory tree where gas exchange takes place is these alveoli. So this 150 milliliters or so, in the average adult, I guess, that we breathe in doesn't do anything. It just stays in the tubes until except the stuff that gets down here. And then we breathe that back out. Now, why is that important and what does that help explain? Well, you've heard of CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Why is that effective? You would think, well, if I'm breathing into this person, I'm breathing in a lot of carbon dioxide. That ain't gonna help him. Perhaps he's got enough of that because he's not breathing. It's starting to build up in his blood. And the answer is, we have this dead space that has a lot of useful oxygen in it, okay? Like from here all the way down to here. So that's how we're able to sort of keep a person's blood oxygenated while we're doing CPR. We're breathing in. Now, granted, we are breathing in carbon dioxide, but we're also breathing in oxygen because this roughly 150 milliliters of air contains 21% oxygen. That's enough to keep somebody alive until you can get them to the hospital or get them to someplace where, you know, you can get them on artificial ventilation. Okay? So remember that anatomical dead space. Okay? And people oftentimes overlook that, but it's important because it helps explain why CPR is effective. All right. Remember that this process of the movement of carbon dioxide from the pulmonary capillaries into the alveoli and the movement of oxygen from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries is by simple diffusion. No energy required. It occurs because things diffuse because they have inherent energy, kinetic energy. And all that's required is a concentration gradient. In other words, there has to be way less of this, the oxygen in the blood, than there is in here. Okay, which there is. Not way less. You know, I think the numbers are something like the difference between 158 millimeters of mercury and 160, but that's enough to move it. You'll notice, if you've ever done it, gone up in elevation, okay, climbing a mountain. Well, I've been skiing in a place in Germany called the Zugspitze, and it's pretty far up there. It's more than a mile or so above sea level. Not as much oxygen up there. So the O2 does not diffuse as readily into the blood because the concentration gradient has been reduced. Okay? Some professional athletes train, particularly runners, they train at high altitude where there's less oxygen because the body does a funny thing. When you subject yourself to a lot of stress and strain at higher altitudes where there's less oxygen, your kidneys sense that and they produce this hormone called erythropoietin, which stimulates the production of more red blood cells. So if you train at 10,000 feet for any extended period of time, your hematocrit goes up. And then when you come back down to sea level, you don't have a 45% hematocrit. You might have a 52% hematocrit, which gives you a greater oxygen carrying capacity, and that benefits endurance runners. Okay? Now, the unscrupulous people, what do? Well, they...
It's called doping, right?
Blood doping, yeah. They'll draw off 1 or 2 units of blood a month before the race, and then a couple of days beforehand, they'll infuse their own blood right back into them to raise their hematocrit. And if you remember what hematocrit is, it's a percentage of your blood that is red blood cells. Yeah, well, the IOC has outlawed blood doping, but you can do it naturally. You know, like some of the best runners or distance and endurance runners in the world are from Kenya, and they train at the upper levels of Mount Kilimanjaro for that purpose. And what can you do about it? It's not illegal, and it works. Okay. Going off on a whole different tangent there, but all right. So, the process of pulmonary ventilation involves inhalation and exhalation. Now, normally, I'm going to leave that up there. Normally, when we inspire or when we inhale, all right, we have this dome-shaped muscle that is attached to the lungs and the base of the pelvis. It's normally a dome shape when it's relaxed, and then when it contracts, it pulls down on the thoracic cavity, and so it increases the volume of the thoracic cavity. Okay, so when the volume goes up, if you remember, there's a fine Irishman, by the way. His name is Boyle. Boyle's law says that volume and pressure are inversely proportional. In other words, when volume goes up, pressure goes down. Now, if you think about it, and you know what pressure is, you know what pressure is? Mathematically, force per unit area. But what causes pressure is the collisions of, in this case, air molecules against the walls of its container. And so what we will call this is the containers in this case will be our lung tissue and our alveoli and our thoracic cavity. So I've got this volume of air, or this volume in a chest cavity, and the air in there is banging up against the walls. Now, if I increase the volume, think about it now, then the number of times that those air molecules bang against the wall of the container is reduced because it's a bigger space. So the pressure goes down. So when our diaphragm contracts, the volume increases. The pressure inside our thoracic cavity drops, and the air pressure outside hasn't changed because we're still at sea level. Let's just say we're working at sea level, is actually pushed into our lungs. Okay? Science doesn't suck, it pushes. It's the same principle as a vacuum cleaner. Okay? In a vacuum cleaner, you have a canister. And attached to that canister is a motor. And what that motor does is it removes air from the canister, reduces the pressure inside the canister so that the ambient air pressure, the outside air pressure, actually pushes whatever's out there into the canister. Same principle if you're in an airplane at 30,000 feet. Okay, you're in a pressurized cabin. Right? They're forcing air into that cabin. It's all sealed, and it roughly equilibrates to a standard air pressure. Well, then you get some idiot with a pistol and he puts a hole in a window. What happens?
Cabin depressurized.
It depressurizes, and what happens to the stuff in the cabin?
All gets sucked outside.
It does not get sucked out.
It
gets pushed out because the pressure outside here is way less than the pressure inside the cabin. So it looks like it's getting sucked out, but it's being pushed out. Same thing happening in our lungs. When our volume, when our intrathoracic pressure drops, air is pushed in. Okay? And that is inhalation. Now, we don't need to concern ourselves with the actual numbers, the differences in millimeters of mercury pressure, but you get the principle. Air is pushed in, and then when the diaphragm relaxes, the volume goes out, the volume drops, so then that the pressure inside the chest is greater than out here, and air is pushed out. Okay? And that, if you ever want to scuba dive or do anything like that, you're going to need to know Boyle's law. But basically, it's fairly simple. It's that pressure and volume at constant temperature now. We can't bring temperature into it because that has an effect. But that when the volume increases, the pressure drops. When the volume decreases, the pressure goes up. They're inversely proportional. Okay? And that's how we inspire or inhale and exhale. Now, we can do a type of inhalation where we force it, because the primary muscle of inhalation is your diaphragm. Now, we have muscles in between our ribs called, there's two of them. One are the external intercostals, and the second one are the internal intercostals. All right, these are two different sets of muscles. They're in between our ribs. Intercostal intercostal, in between the ribs. Okay, now we can do forced inhalation, and that will, we use these during forced inhalation. You know, like you've been out and you just run a mile, and you're trying to get air in and out, and you're incorporating, and then you're recruiting these external intercostals. And we know we can also do forced exhalation. Like if I take a breath in, normal breath, tidal volume about a half a liter, then I can force out more air, okay, to a point. Then you would recruit the internal intercostals. So for forced inhalation, we recruit the external intercostals. For forced exhalation, L-A-T-I-O-N, we use the internal intercostals, okay? All right, now, having said that, because I got about 20 minutes, your assignment in the discussion board was to examine normal pulmonary volumes in the average adult, you know, a tall, I think it said a male, okay? But I'll bring up a couple of them just so that we can refer to them. But we have two, you know, we have
Table 16.2 on
table
page
16.2.
467.
Yeah.
Page 467.
Yeah. All right. Yes. Okay, so you can see it references things like tidal volume, which is just the, we have regular, normal, quiet breathing. Write this word down. It's called eupnea. Okay, and that's just normal, quiet breathing. Just like you're doing right now. Okay, and then we've got dyspnea, D-Y-S, that prefix means difficulty. So that's difficulty breathing. Oh, okay. All right, let me see. Before we go too much farther. Now, because this is important. In these, we get back to these alveoli where the gas exchange takes place. And I'll kind of blow these up a little bit. We have these grape-like clusters, all right, lined with cells. Okay, and those cells are bathed like every other cell in your body, save the ones that are on the extreme surface of your skin. They're bathed in water. Now, if you remember, you may not, but I'm going to refresh your memory. Water, H2O, is a polar molecule. In other words, there's an unequal distribution of electric charge in the between the oxygen and the hydrogens that make up water. One end of the water molecule is partially negatively charged, and one end, where the hydrogens are, is partially positively charged. And as you might expect, there is an attraction between the negative end of one water molecule and the positive end of another water molecule. Okay, and those types of attraction are called hydrogen bonds. Now, who gives a crap about that when we're talking about the lungs? Well, these cells in the alveoli are bathed in water. And so there is an overall, this attraction, water is attracted to itself. Like if I had a sink, I could take a little handful of water, put it on the table, and it would beat up because these molecules are all attracted to themselves. Okay? And that creates what is known as surface tension. like if I fill a tube like this full of water, you'll notice that there's a downward pull in the tube so that the water is attracted to itself. That property is called cohesion. Anyway, water is attracted to itself and it creates a surface tension. Now, if you think about that in this respect, these cells that make up these alveoli are bathed in water, so there is a tendency for these water molecules to be attracted to each other and create a high surface tension inside these alveoli, these air sacs, and the tendency is for them to collapse because you have all this inward force, these water molecules attracted to each other, okay? Now, as we develop in utero, and it escapes me at the moment when it happens, but there is a type of cell inside these alveoli called a type 2 alveolar cell. Okay, and they produce a very important substance, and that substance is called surfactant. Okay, now who cares about that? Well, we do, because when we're developing in utero, our lungs are still closed. We don't start breathing until we come out of the cereal box, and air pressure hits us and air is pushed into our lungs and it opens up our air sacs. Contrary to popular belief, you don't need a smack on the butt or anything like that. Being exposed to air pressure is going to force air into your lungs. If you're born underwater, that ain't going to happen until you come up and are exposed to air pressure. All right, now this surfactant, what it does is it helps to break up these bonds between the water molecules and reduce surface tension to keep the air sacs open, okay? Surfactant reduces surface tension, okay, to keep air sacs open, all right? Now, I bring that up because a problem with premature infants, infants born before 40 weeks, I guess born before 32 weeks, maybe, and I don't know the exact time, but these type 2 alveolar cells in these premature infants are not fully developed. They are not producing enough or any of this surfactant. So it's very difficult for their alveolar sacs to stay open. So what do they do to those kids? What usually happens to an infant that's born premature?
Put on a ventilator.
He's put on a ventilator under positive pressure ventilation to force air in there and keep those sacs open. And then they'll keep a positive end expiratory pressure to keep them open. They also put bovine from a cow, they'll put bovine surfactant down that tube to help break up these bonds so that the water's not so strongly attracted to itself and keep those air sacs open. And then you wait, the child stays on a ventilator until he's producing enough of his own surfactant, or she, to keep the alveoli open, okay? Important point. Double important point. Remember that stuff. Surfactant. And what it does is it reduces the surface tension in the alveolar sacs. Okay? All right. I'm not going to go through your capacities and your volumes. You're going to do that on your own because you need to do that anyway. And, all right. A couple of important points, and then I'm going to have to call it pretty quick. We have an area in our brainstem, the pons, that regulates the respiratory rate, okay, in the brainstem. Now, the primary driver, or the primary stimulus, I should say, for respiration, well, let me ask you, what do you think it is?
The primary stimulus for respiration.
Yeah, what would make you breathe faster and or slower? What do you think? Can't be wrong, just...
Well, I mean, same thing like adrenaline, or I mean, just some type of a hormone or something like that.
But think about it in terms of during respiration, what are we trying to do? Trying to get O2 in, trying to get CO2 out.
Right.
So the primary driver is going to involve one or the other of those.
Right.
So would you think, is it a low CO2 level? I mean a low oxygen level or a high CO2 level?
It would be to motivate breathing.
To motivate breathing.
It would be a low CO2, high CO2 level.
That's it. That's the one. It's a high CO2. Your carbon dioxide level is your primary stimulus to drive your respiratory rate. Okay, the normal adult breathes between 8 and 12 times a minute. Okay, and to help you remember that, very, very difficult to hold your breath indefinitely. Now, if you're strong-willed enough, you can hold your breath until you pass out. But then your brainstem is going to kick in and it's going to send nervous impulses to your diaphragm and you're going to breathe. And why? Brings us back to this. Because when you hold your breath, carbon dioxide starts to accumulate in your blood because you're not getting rid of it. All right? And you're starting to produce more and more of this carbonic acid. Now, granted, this is a relatively weak acid, but it is an acid nonetheless. All right? And over a period of time, and not a long period of time, you remember what normal blood pH is?
7 something?
It is 7.35 to 7.45. Go either direction, and you start entering into conditions that are not compatible with life. So, you hold your breath, your CO2 builds up, you start to produce larger amounts of this carbonic acid, your blood pH starts to drop. You have chemoreceptors in your brainstem that will sense that change in pH and say, nope, sorry, breathe, and then you'll start breathing. When I was a kid, one of the competitions that we used to have was to see who could swim the farthest underwater. Okay, well, I learned early on, before you dive into the water and start your laps, you hyperventilate. You blow off as much CO2 as you can, because it's going to accumulate and eventually you're going to have to start breathing. So you get rid of as much of it and then you'll last longer underwater, because when it reaches a certain point, you're going to breathe. Okay, so the primary drive, respiratory drive, is
CO2.
your CO2. Okay. Briefly okay, look at the, I don't think I went too deep into the control of breathing on 512.
Okay.
Yeah, you know, like I said, you have these areas in the brain stem.
All right.
And you look in the ponds and you see the different areas, but I'm not going to worry about that so much. Know what hyperventilation is and hypoventilation.